A warm welcome to each and all of you, lovers of New York City history, architecture, politics, and social justice, gathered today to honor and celebrate the life and work of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, Chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, a group of dedicated individuals who are committed to informing the public about the past, the present, and the future of historic preservation in our city. Our warmest thanks to our collaborators in this initial effort to bring more cultural medallions to neighborhoods and to Murray Hill. Susan Demmett, the heroine of the day, thank you. And the members of the Murray Hill Neighborhood Association, to Yoshiki Shimada and Catherine Collison, the owners of this lovely building, and to all of you for joining us here today. We'd also like to recognize Susan Elliott, the founding principal, and Ava Goldman, a senior from Eleanor Roosevelt High School. We're very pleased you are here too. To remind you, this event is being videotaped and will be available to the public via YouTube as part of the DS video archives housed in the David Rubenstein Library at Duke University. Fifth cousins, once removed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, were born only 2 years apart. Franklin in 1882 in the Hudson Valley, the town of Hyde Park, and Eleanor in 1884 in Manhattan. After the death of her parents, her mother in 1892, when she was 8 years old, her father in 1894, when she was 10 years old, Eleanor, as she preferred to be called, lived with her grandmother in Tivoli, New York, until at the age of 15, she was sent to a private finishing school in England. And there, Eleanor encountered progressive ideals that would form the basis of her worldview. In 1902, she returned to New York Her distant cousin, Franklin, often described as a pampered only child, was raised in an atmosphere of wealth and privilege. He made frequent trips to Europe, where he became conversant in French and German. Educated by tutors until the age of 14, Franklin attended Groton and then Harvard, and by the time he lived in this house, the Columbia Law School. Although close in age, Franklin and Eleanor only met in 1902 on a train to Tivoli, New York. And then they began a secret correspondence and courtship and were engaged a year later. On March 17, 1905, St. Patrick's Day, they were married. The date was chosen to accommodate the schedule of the then President Theodore Roosevelt, who would be in New York City to attend the St. Patrick's Day parade and had promised to give the bride away. The year before their wedding, Franklin had enrolled in Columbia Law School. He continued to study even during their honeymoon abroad, and upon returning in what Franklin called their 14-foot mansion, which was rented, where their first 2 children were born, In 1907, Franklin passed the bar exam and then took a job with a prestigious law firm inspired by his wife's uncle example, and he followed him into politics. Before I tell the entire story, I thought it would be a good idea that our experts do that. I'd like to call first on Harold Holzer, who for many years was the vice president for communications at the Metropolitan Museum. 23 years, if I remember. And now, this stand, by the way, from 1905 also. In 2015, Harold Holzer became the executive director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. A prolific writer of books, articles, pamphlets, and monographs. In 2008, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Bush. From 2000 to 2010, he served as co-chair of the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, the passion of his life, and as chair of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome Harold Holzer.
I'm going to make my own accommodation with this stand here. Barbaralee, thank you. Thank you for organizing this beautiful ceremony. Thank you for the weather, which I attribute to you. And thank you for all you do to remind New Yorkers of our heritage and our commitment to the history and the landmarks that you've done so much to identify and preserve and write about. Your scholarship and your dedication really are the moving forces behind this program. And I'm glad we reached the Roosevelt landmark today. So thank you, Barbaralee. So as director, as Barbaralee says, of Franklin and Eleanor's second and final New York City home up on 65th Street, it's gratifying now to be able to connect the dots between this remarkable couple's start in life here to the 30 years, to the 25 years they spent together just 30 blocks uptown, where, as you probably know, Franklin recovered from polio, resumed his political career, and ultimately conducted his transition between November 1932 and 1933 as they prepared to move to Washington. As most people who know that house know, it was Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who built the Uptown house as a wedding present for Franklin and Eleanor while they resided here. That house was under construction. What I didn't quite know until I did some reading about this house, and I shouldn't have been surprised, was that Sarah was the real estate agent who found this house for Franklin and Eleanor, and furnished it, and negotiated the rent, which was $2,400 a year. That's it. $2,400 a year, which FDR said was just right for us. I hear it's a little more now, but we can. So Sarah, again, she was the negotiator, and then turned right from this arrangement to building the house on 65th Street, as you may know, as two separate townhouses, which she later decided needed to be opened up so it was one. And as Eleanor said, she was then in their side of the house for the next 25 years at the least expected moments. Use your imagination on that. We call it Uptown the first New Deal. But probably this was the first New Deal, right? With Sarah as the realtor. And what could have been more perfect than this community for Franklin and Eleanor? It was a community filled in those days with their social peers, with professionals, with doctors and lawyers, only a couple of blocks from the new B. Altman's, which we hear Eleanor liked very much, and where Tiffany's was located in those days. Just a few blocks from the Episcopal Church of the Incarnation, whose congregation Eleanor joined in 1902, and of course fairly close up the block to Grand Central Terminal and access to Hyde Park, which was a retreat for them. And by the way, Sarah was living in a brownstone very close by, so that arrangement was obviously part of the lifelong deal. What I found out that I was most interested in, and I credit Roosevelt House's wonderful curator, Deborah Gardner, for bringing this to my attention. I have no idea if they befriended them or knew them, but it's my own personal excitement to find out from Deborah that among their neighbors was a lady named Mary Isham. Now, Mary Isham was a Republican, but she was also the granddaughter of another president, Abraham Lincoln. And she lived right nearby, and interestingly, she lived past Franklin Roosevelt's second election to the presidency. So I'm happy to make the connection. As Barbaralee and all of us know, places make the connection to living people and to history, and to know that this was the incubating spot for the great things that Franklin and Eleanor did later is deeply moving, and we're just happy to be part of this ceremony and to be present at the medallion ceremony that you organized, Barbaralee. Thank you.
And now, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, the Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the CUNY Graduate Center. Was honored by the New York State Council on the Humanities as Scholar of the Year in 1996. In 2016, she completed the third and final volume of her award-winning, best-selling biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. For more than 20 years, she produced and hosted her own radio program at Radio Pacifica. She's appeared frequently on many networks and news hours, and it is a pleasure to welcome Blanche Cook.
Thank you. No.
Hold on.
I'm so moved, Barbaralee. I'm so moved to be here with all of you, and this is very exciting. I would just like to add two things to what has already been said. Greenwich Village. Did you do the plaque on 20 East 11th Street? That was the home of Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed, and Eleanor Roosevelt loved the village. Greenwich Village. Hearts open, fists high. And her last home was in the village at Washington Square Park, a wonderful home that, unlike 20 East 11th Street, which was a walk-up, and FDR couldn't go there, and that was her hideaway house for much of the presidency, but she got the Washington Square apartment because he'd be very comfortable there, and indeed during the 1944 campaign he visited and he stayed there and he dried off. He was campaigning during a horrific rainstorm, and so the village is part of Eleanor Roosevelt's vision. And the other thing I'd like to add is Allenswood was not a finishing school. It was more a preparatory school for higher learning. And there still is no biography of Marie Souvestre, the brilliant, radical headmistress, as she was known, of Allenswood. So if the papers are in French and they're in Paris and London, so hey, somebody really needs to do a biography of Marie Souvestre. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great hero who lived in spectacular buildings. It's sort of fascinating that Sarah Delano Roosevelt found these houses and built these houses, which Eleanor didn't love as much as she loved the village, where she had independence and was away from Hushviga. Okay. I think it's great, Barbaralee, the work that you're doing all over the city. We were in the village the other day for the dedication for Edie Windsor, which was so incredibly moving, as this is incredibly moving. Thank you for your work and your vision and our heritage, which is New York City. And I want to say one final thing. B. Altman's is the home of the Graduate Center. My office is on the 5th floor, where there were shoes and scarves. Okay. So it's wonderful to think of Eleanor Roosevelt haunting the halls of the Graduate Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blanche, for your very important work. Our next speaker, William Vanden Heuvel, is the chair emeritus and founder of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute. He led the effort, and that is an understatement, he led the effort to build the Four Freedoms Memorial and Park on Roosevelt Island. And if you haven't been there, I hope you will put it on your spring calendar. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel served as Deputy U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, as U.S. Ambassador to the European Office of the UN, and as President of the International Rescue Committee. In his auspicious career, and I've just given you a few of the highlights, he served as Executive Assistant to General William J. Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, and Wild Bill Vanden Heuvel, Special Counsel to Governor Averell Harriman, an assistant as well to Attorney General Robert Kennedy. A special warm welcome to Ambassador Vanden Heuvel.
Thank you, Barbaralee, and let me begin by saluting you as our colleagues have done. I don't know any single person who has done more to preserve the culture and the history of our city, state, and country than you have. So thank you for bringing this to today.
Bill, pick up the mic.
We are, as has been referred to, Theodore Roosevelt came to New York in 1905 on St. Patrick's Day and essentially presided at the wedding of his beloved niece, Eleanor, who married a person with a good name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After the honeymoon following that wedding, they came here. This was the beginning of the relationship of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Two of their children were born here. They then moved to, as Harold says, to 65th Street. But it's a very important thing to remember this journey. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were certainly among the greatest Americans of the 20th century, had more influence on the world than any other American president. And Mrs. Roosevelt was a source of inspiration and hope to everybody who needed help in this world. I always cite Franklin Roosevelt's polio. It wasn't just a matter that he had difficulty recovering. He never walked again. He couldn't stand alone. And from that disposition, he came and ran for governor and then president of the United States. Imagine that extraordinary triumphant journey. Elected 4 times as president, unequal situation in America, and a person who opened up our government to the needs of its people, who led this nation in a triumphant alliance with the democracies of the world to save us from totalitarianism and Nazism. I suggest that all of our friends begin here when they take the walk in New York that identifies Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and then go over to the United Nations and see the building that Franklin Roosevelt believed could be the fixture by which we could save the peace, and the building and the organization where Eleanor Roosevelt singularly wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most important documents in the history of the world relating to the rights of the individual. So we visit the United Nations, we visit then the Four Freedoms Park in January 6, 1941. Franklin Roosevelt faced a world where he knew war would envelop us as well. And he said that the only way we could justify the terrible costs of that war was to understand that we had the responsibility for helping nations build themselves on the basis of the four freedoms. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Let me close today by reminding us of what Arthur Schlesinger once said. He said, history is to a nation what memory is to a person. If a person loses their memory, they lose their sense of who they are, their identity, their direction. I suggest to you that we are in danger as a nation of losing our history. And it's incumbent upon all of us who believe in what Franklin and Roosevelt stood for to stand up at every opportunity that we have to say, this is the America we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Vanden Heuvel. And next speaker, Jonathan Alter, is an award-winning author, reporter, columnist, radio host, and television producer and analyst. His books include 3 New York Times bestsellers. Number 1, The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies in 2013. 2, The Promise, President Obama Year 1 in 2010. And 3, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, 2006, which was also one of the notable books of the year, of that year. Since 1996, he's been an analyst and a contributing correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. He's written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, and many other notable publications. And now, among other things, he is a twice-weekly columnist for the Daily Beast. A warm welcome to Jonathan Alter.
Thank you so much, Barbaralee. I'm so honored to be in this company. I mean, this is the all-star team of the people who have kept Franklin and Eleanor's memory alive. The will to forget, the national amnesia that we have is so powerful that it needs the people who have gathered here today to keep this usable past alive. Every nation, every people needs a usable past to draw on, to confront in their own time. And some of you may be familiar with the book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's called No Ordinary Time. And that's a line from Eleanor Roosevelt. It referred to the beginning of World War II, but I think we can all agree that today is no ordinary time. And I just wanted to try very briefly to give you a little bit of a sense of what Franklin and Eleanor at the time they were here were doing and about to do. So, married in 1905, you know, as the reporter type, I always have to give you the kind of story that you don't get in the official history. So, President Theodore Roosevelt gives away Eleanor as the bride, and they said of Theodore Roosevelt that he had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. And he sucked up so much of the energy in the room that at a certain point, just before they moved here, Eleanor and Franklin were standing alone, and all the guests were gathered around the president. So they come here, and Franklin is at Columbia Law School. He is not doing particularly well at Columbia Law School. He's not law review or anything like that. And he goes and works at a law firm called Carter Ledger. And Commodore Ledyard, who was the senior partner at the firm, at one point says to Sarah Roosevelt, "It's no use. Franklin doesn't have the makings of a lawyer." So he went into politics. And at this time, Eleanor is, even before they were married, she is introducing a social conscience to Franklin. And she's working down at Christadora House. She's working with Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side. And it's a totally new world for him. And she wouldn't have married him if she hadn't seen that compassion that was inside of him. And she also, in this period, is becoming very active in Democratic politics. She's head of Women Democrats of New York. You know, it wasn't for another decade before women got the right to vote. But even before that, she's urging women to get involved in politics. And then she's very, very important in the Democratic Party of New York City and New York. And Franklin is elected to the state senate in 1910. And what is most striking to me about his election from up in the Hyde Park area is that he went around and heard the same message from voters. They were interested in security. That's the word that we kept hearing over and over again, security. You know, there had been a panic and a lot of people lost their money. Nothing to fall back on, no sense of security. He took that concept and he made it the centerpiece of everything he did, not just social security, but the concept of collective security in the United Nations, which he founded, and that has kept the peace for the last 70 years. We have not had a world war, which is astonishing if you look at it in the broad sweep of human history, that we've not had a truly major war in all the years since World War II. As much destruction, not a major world war. So a lot of people killed in a lot of wars all over the world. But if you look at it in the scope of human history, it's a very interesting book, Sapiens, that describes all of this. It is an astonishing development how much peace there has been in the time since World War II. In any event, I just wanted to sort of end by saying what, on a partisan note, people like to say, don't want to be partisan. Eleanor and Franklin were partisans. Franklin described himself, when he was asked, what are your politics? He said, I'm a Christian and a Democrat. And they would, right now, I'm very confident in saying, they would be relentlessly focused on getting the House of Representatives back from the banana Republicans who are in control right now, in order to repair the guardrails of our democracy. And I think they would be digging deep. They would be getting Sarah to kick in and any of the other fundraisers they knew to kick in, because this is no ordinary time, and it's all hands on deck, as an old Navy man like Franklin Roosevelt would have said. So thank you so much for coming out today and for keeping the memory of these two great Americans alive in our time.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your stirring words and your very important reminder. Referring to those books reminded me of an earlier book about that period, and it does apply to this period. Eric Goldman's Rendezvous with Destiny, and this generation has its own rendezvous with destiny. And as you say, we better get out there, not give money, register to vote and vote, and that will make all the difference, and we need a difference. Phoebe Roosevelt is a great-granddaughter of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She holds a master's degree in American history from Columbia University and a law degree from Fordham, where she was a Stein Scholar. She was particularly interested in public interest law and ethics. She's been a high school American history teacher, an attorney with the Affirmative Action Litigation Division of the New York City Law Department for 7 years, after serving a year as a law clerk in what we've now learned to call the Sovereign District of New York. She's been a stay-at-home mom of 3 children for the past 12 years, and she happily serves on the board of the Roosevelt Institute. A warm welcome to you, Phoebe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Barbaralee. I feel very humbled to be amongst these other speakers, and when Barbaralee asked me to speak today, I thought, oh my gosh, what could I possibly contribute here? I did not inherit the public speaking gene, so I need to rely heavily on my notes. I don't know that I really came up with a good answer about what I would say here today, but I came anyway because I'm at this moment in time, I do really feel inspired more than I have in my past to honor the legacy of my great-grandparents. It's in part because I do feel, as Jonathan alluded to, I feel like democracy is really under threat today, and it's just a moment for even those of us who feel shy to come out and do what we can. So that's why I'm here. It's also, for that reason, I became involved with the Roosevelt Institute, which Ambassador Vanden Heuvel founded, as Barbaralee mentioned, and that's a great honor for me as well. So today I want to talk briefly about FDR and Eleanor's political legacy, as others have, and I'm going to try to tie it into our built environment here in New York. I wanted to talk about the intersection of compassionate politics and physical structures, since we are here honoring a building today, in a way. When FDR first took office in 1933, he had to immediately confront the fact that 13 million Americans were out of work and millions more were underemployed. Also, there were some basic capital improvements that were needed to help the country function as the world moved from the 19th century toward the middle of the 20th, such as improved roads, more widespread electrification, flood controls, reforestation, more and better schools, and parks to offset the growing urban density. Therefore, one of FDR's first impulses when he assumed office was to create government-funded jobs programs that resulted not only in wages for millions of people, but also the creation of thousands of well-built public structures and spaces. It was construction by the people and for the people, immediate relief for the jobless, as well as a great and lasting contribution to American infrastructure. It was our city of New York here that was actually the single greatest recipient of New Deal public works. And we have the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Central Park Zoo, LaGuardia Airport, the A and C subway lines, and Brooklyn College, among many others, to show for it. I should mention that all of these infrastructure projects are currently being documented by an organization called the Living New Deal. Its efforts are complementary to the work of the Historical Landmarks Preservation Center and of Barbaralee, in that it tries to honor the built environment. But rather than focusing on culture, it aims to illustrate a political point. That is, it showcases what can be achieved through public works. Our democracy depends on the economic security of our people, and that means not only access to jobs, but also access to infrastructure essentials. That is where the intersection of compassionate politics and the history of building in the New Deal lies, and it still lies today. As we look around us here in New York City, we're cognizant of its remarkable place in history. Everywhere we can see buildings where genius flourished or where world-changing events took place. And I thank the work of the Historical Landmarks Preservation Center for helping us to remember all that, and as others have said, just keeping alive the history of New York and celebrating its present and future as well. I hope that the important cultural medallion at this particular site prompts us to think about the values of the New Deal and how we can honor them in our own lives and times. Thank you so much.
I know you will agree that, as someone mentioned, this is the all-star team, the SWAT team of Roosevelt history. Can we collectively thank them again with your applause? Thank you all. The Cultural Medallion program, would you come forward, please, was really based on programs that I saw throughout Europe. Most notably, what is called the Blue Marker program in London. You may have seen those pale blue markers that will say, Disraeli slept here, or Handel played here. We give the unexpurgated version as much as we can on a tiny plaque. There are now, and it is run, for example, in London, in England, by English Heritage, and it started in 1860. They have 900 medallions in that country. We have a long way to catch up. We started 18 years ago, and we have 115 medallions, one or two missing in action someplace, somewhere. So we need your help. If you know of and you have verifiable information and know of an individual who has made a significant contribution, provable, and know where they resided, know George Washington slept here, in a building that still exists, please let us know. We want to learn, and if you want to learn more about our programs, please see www.hlpc.org. And thanks to each and all of you for joining us here today on this thoroughfare that represents really the pulsing heart of New York, for celebrating the life and work of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, here where history happened. Now we will dedicate the Cultural Medallion. It is the first time one hasn't been installed, and that's too long a story to share now, but it will be installed. And we've asked Susan Demmett, who has spearheaded the Murray Hill program, to please hold the plaque. And Deborah Gershad, who is the executive director of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. Deborah, will you please read the text?
Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived here in their 14-foot mansion from their marriage in 1905 until 1908, when they and their growing family moved to 4749 East 65th Street. Elected to the New York Senate in 1910, Franklin later served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. After recuperating from polio in the 20s, he was elected Governor of New York in 1928 and President of the United States in 1932. FDR launched the New Deal, which helped rescue the country from the Great Depression, and won re-election 3 more times, a record 4 terms. Renowned for his global leadership during the Second World War, he died in Warm Springs, Georgia in 1945, shortly after establishing the United Nations. As the longest-serving First Lady, Eleanor wrote a daily newspaper called My Day and traveled widely as the eyes and ears of her husband. She later chaired the UN's Human Rights Commission and was the driving force behind the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Thanks to each and all of you for coming.
Barbaralee.